This film presents an investigative-style examination of publicly documented events, official records, and witness testimony related to the December 1980 Rendlesham Forest case. Certain scenes are dramatized or reconstructed for storytelling purposes. Visuals may be AI generated, enhanced, or reconstructed to create an immersive viewing experience. This content is presented for commentary and entertainment and should not be treated as a definitive account. Names and ranks referenced are drawn from public record and official military and government documentation. Suffolk, England. Just after 3 in the morning, in the final week of December, 1980. On a stretch of pine forest wedged between two American air bases, a security patrol sees something descending through the trees. What they find, or claim to find, will become the most thoroughly documented UFO case in British history. Not because of a grainy photograph, not because of a single anonymous witness, but because of an official United States Air Force memorandum addressed to the British government. An 18-minute audio recording made in real time by a senior officer narrating events as they happened. And sworn testimony, some of it given decades later under oath, from military personnel who never withdrew their claims. For over 40 years, researchers, skeptics, journalists, and the British Ministry of Defence itself have picked this case apart, piece by piece. And for over 40 years, no single explanation has managed to account for everything that was reported. They call it Britain's Roswell. Tonight, we go through the record, the statements, the memo, the tape, and the physical evidence, and lay out exactly what is documented, what is disputed, and what, even now, remains unexplained. To understand what happened in Rendlesham Forest, you first have to understand where it happened and why that location matters. RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge were, on paper, Royal Air Force stations. In practice, by December of 1980, they were operated almost entirely by the United States Air Force, home to the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing. This was the height of the Cold War. NATO's air defense network in Western Europe depended on installations exactly like these: nuclear-capable aircraft on constant alert, hardened aircraft shelters, and a security culture built around a single, unshakable assumption that anything unusual near the perimeter fence could be a Soviet probe of NATO's defenses, or worse, a prelude to something far more serious. This was not a base staffed by amateurs, and it was not an environment where security personnel were encouraged to imagine things. Every airman on that perimeter had been trained, drilled, and re-drilled to treat anomalies as potential threats first, and curiosities a distant second. That detail matters enormously to how you interpret what follows. Because the men who first responded to the lights in Rendlesham Forest were not looking for a UFO. They were looking for a downed aircraft, or worse, an infiltration. Rendlesham Forest itself sat between the two bases. A working plantation of tightly packed conifers, crisscrossed by Forestry Service roads, bordering open farmland to the east toward the coast. To the men stationed at Bentwaters and Woodbridge, it was simply the buffer zone between the flight line and the outside world. A place you drove through on patrol, not a place anything was supposed to happen. On the night of December the 25th into the 26th, the base was running on a skeleton crew. Christmas leave had emptied out much of the personnel roster. The men still on duty were pulling routine security patrols, walking and driving the perimeter, watching for nothing more dramatic than poachers, stray livestock, or the occasional local trespasser cutting through toward the coast road. Just after 3 in the morning, that routine broke. A security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge reported strange lights beyond the fence line, apparently descending into the forest. Their first working theory was the only one available to trained personnel in that moment. An aircraft was going down. On a base handling nuclear-capable assets, a downed aircraft anywhere nearby was treated as an emergency, requiring an immediate physical response, not a phone call to a duty officer to be dealt with in the morning. 2 men were dispatched on foot to investigate directly: Airman First Class John Burroughs and Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston. Neither had any reason to expect the night would end any differently than a routine security check. Neither had any idea that the next hour of their lives would be picked apart by researchers, journalists, and skeptics for the next 4 decades. What they radioed back to the base, and what they later testified to in signed statements taken by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the branch responsible for exactly this category of incident, did not match a crashed aircraft. Not in shape, not in behavior, and not, according to them, in anything either man had ever encountered before. According to Penniston's account, as the 2 men pushed deeper into the forest along a service track, the light ahead of them stopped behaving like anything on fire, or anything mechanically wrecked. It pulsed. It shifted in color and intensity. And as they closed the distance, they realized it wasn't lying broken on the ground. It appeared to be hovering, low, just above the forest floor. Penniston would later describe the object in exacting, almost clinical detail, consistent with the kind of methodical observation his training as a security specialist had drilled into him. A metallic, triangular structure, he said, roughly 9 feet across at its widest point and about 6 feet high. A single red light positioned at the apex. A band of blue-white light running along the underside, close to ground level. And a surface unlike any material he could immediately classify. Smooth, almost glass-like, but clearly structural rather than decorative. In his official statement, taken within hours of the encounter, Penniston said he circled the object at a cautious distance, taking notes in the small notepad he carried on every patrol, sketching its outline, recording rough measurements, doing exactly what a trained security specialist is supposed to do when confronted with an unidentified object on a secure installation. Document first, react second. And then, he says, he noticed the markings. Symbols, rows of angular, almost hieroglyphic characters running along the lower portion of the object's hull. Not painted onto the surface, but pressed into it, embedded, as if the material itself had been formed around them during manufacture rather than applied afterward. He copied what he could into his notepad, working quickly in the cold, aware the object could move again at any moment. Penniston's statement goes further still. He says he reached out and touched the surface of the object, and that it was warm. Not hot, not electrified, but distinctly warm to the touch, in stark contrast to the near-freezing December night around him. As he made contact, he says his own movements began to slow, as though something about the surface or the object itself was drawing energy directly out of his body. Then, without any warning sound or visible mechanism, the object lifted from the forest floor and began moving away. Not in a straight climb overhead, but weaving low between the tree trunks, at what Penniston described as an impossibly controlled speed for something that size, before suddenly accelerating upward through the canopy and disappearing into the night sky. Burroughs, in his own separately taken statement, a detail investigators considered significant since the 2 men were debriefed apart from one another specifically to prevent their accounts from influencing each other, corroborated the core shape of the encounter, the pulsing light, the triangular object, its movement through the trees, and one additional detail that neither man had discussed beforehand: the strange behavior of animals on a nearby farm, which both men independently described as going into a frenzy as the object passed overhead. Barking, bellowing, and general agitation from livestock that, moments earlier, had been silent. When Burroughs and Penniston returned to base, they were taken in separately by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations for formal debriefing. Their notes, sketches, and verbal statements were collected as part of an internal file. Standard procedure for any incident touching directly on base security. And the following morning, in daylight, investigators went back to the site to document what remained. What they found were 3 small, roughly triangular depressions pressed into the forest floor, spaced in a pattern. consistent with some form of landing gear, along with broken and scorched branches high in the surrounding tree canopy. Damage consistent with something large passing through the tree line at a height well above what any ground vehicle could reach, and well below normal aircraft altitude. Taken on its own, this might have remained a strange, isolated field report, logged, filed, and quietly forgotten within a busy Cold War installation. But 2 nights later, the case escalated in a way that would ensure it was never forgotten. This time, the deputy base commander himself would walk into that forest, with a tape recorder running the entire time. Lieutenant Colonel Charles the Halt was the deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters, a career Air Force officer with decades of service, not a man whose professional reputation was built on chasing rumors. When word of continued unusual activity near the forest reached him in the final days of December 1980, he made a decision that would permanently place his name at the center of UFO history. He chose to lead the follow-up investigation personally, and to document it in real time using a handheld tape recorder. The recording that resulted, now known in UFO research circles simply as the Halt Tape, runs approximately 18 minutes. It was not released publicly at the time. Years later, a copy reached independent researchers, and its authenticity has never seriously been disputed, even by the case's harshest skeptics. What makes it unusual, compared to almost every other piece of UFO evidence produced anywhere in the world, is that it isn't a retrospective account, recalled months or years after the fact, and shaped by memory. It is a senior military officer narrating events, live, as his patrol experienced them. The kind of contemporaneous record investigators in almost any other field would consider close to gold standard evidence. On the tape, Halt's patrol first moves toward the site of the earlier encounter, where they take radiation readings at the triangular ground depressions using a military-issue Geiger counter. Halt can be heard describing the readings as significantly elevated compared to background levels measured elsewhere in the forest. A detail that would later become one of the most fiercely contested claims in the entire case. From there, following a tip from a local forester who had joined the patrol and pointed toward unusual activity on the horizon, the team's attention shifts skyward, toward a bright light pulsing somewhere out toward the coast. For much of the remaining recording, Halt narrates the behavior of this object almost like a field report dictated for the record. A strange, star-like light, low on the horizon, moving erratically rather than tracking in a fixed orbit or flight path, and at points appearing to project a narrow beam of light downward toward the ground. His men watched the light for a considerable stretch of the night. At several points on the tape, Halt can be heard giving quiet, controlled instructions to keep weapons lowered and to avoid provoking any reaction. The voice of a commander deliberately trying to keep a tense, confusing situation from escalating into something worse, rather than a man performing drama for an audience. Weeks later, in January of 1981, Halt formalized the account into an official memorandum addressed to the British Ministry of Defence, a document that would later be released under the Freedom of Information Act, and that remains, to this day, one of the single most consequential pieces of paper in the history of UFO research. Not because it proves an extraterrestrial origin, it doesn't claim to, but because of what it is. An on-the-record, signed statement, filed through official channels from a senior United States Air Force officer describing an object his team could not identify, exhibiting what he explicitly termed intelligent control. The British Ministry of Defence's eventual public response, once the memo surfaced years later, was measured almost to the point of dismissiveness. The events, officials stated, held no defense significance, and were accordingly not investigated further as a security matter. For much of the following 2 decades, that single administrative line was treated by skeptics as the closing word on the entire case. But no defense significance is a bureaucratic judgment about national security implications. It is not the same as explained. And Halt, for his part, never once walked back his account in the decades that followed, despite considerable professional and public pressure to do so. Nearly 30 years after the events themselves, in a sworn affidavit dated the 23rd of June, 2010, Halt stated under oath that the objects his team observed, both the craft reportedly on the ground and the light observed in the sky, were not man-made and exhibited intelligent control. A retired lieutenant colonel choosing to put his name and his word to that statement in a formal legal document decades after retirement, with nothing obvious to gain from maintaining the claim, is not something conventional explanations can dismiss without serious consideration. Holt has also stated, in later interviews, that his own inquiries within his chain of command in the aftermath suggested broader interest in the case at higher levels of the Department of Defense. Though the specific records he has referenced have never been publicly produced or confirmed. It's an unresolved thread in an already unresolved case, a claim that cannot be verified, but that comes from a source whose credibility on every other point has held up under decades of scrutiny. No serious examination of Rendlesham can proceed without confronting the explanations offered by skeptics directly. Because unlike many UFO cases built on a single blurry photograph or an uncorroborated story, this one comes with genuine, testable counter-evidence that deserves to be laid out in full. The most persistent and widely cited explanation centers on Orphanus Lighthouse, positioned roughly 5 miles east of the forest along the Suffolk coastline. Critics have long argued that its rotating beam, glimpsed through dense tree cover at an unfamiliar angle by men who may not have had a clear mental map of exactly which lights belonged where along that stretch of coast at 3 in the morning, could plausibly account for at least part of what witnesses described as a pulsing light beyond the tree line, particularly during the extended skywatching phase of Holt's investigation on the second night. Independent astronomers examining the case have also pointed to a documented bright fireball meteor, reported over southern England around the same period in late December 1980. A genuine, corroborated natural event that could reasonably explain a brief, dramatic streak of light in the sky, witnessed by the initial patrol in the moments before they entered the forest and shifted their attention to the object at ground level. Some skeptical researchers push this line of reasoning further still, proposing that the entire case is best understood as layered misidentification compounding over time. A genuine meteor sighting kicking off the first night's report, a lighthouse beam misread as something closer and stranger on the second night, and each subsequent retelling adding new detail through the ordinary, well-documented distortions of memory, group discussion, and years of witnesses comparing notes with one another and with outside researchers. It's a coherent theory, and to its credit, it's one that even some of the case's own witnesses have entertained rather than dismissed outright. One local landowner near the forest, present in the community for years following the incident, eventually came to believe that whatever debris was associated with the site may have originated from a Russian satellite re-entering the atmosphere rather than anything extraterrestrial, while still conceding, in her own words, that there had been such a significant cover-up around the case that no one would likely ever know the full truth of what happened. But the lighthouse and meteor theory carries a persistent, difficult problem: timeline and personnel. These were trained military security specialists, stationed at that base for extended periods, whose job specifically required them to be familiar with the surrounding landscape, coastline, and landmarks well enough to distinguish a genuine security threat from a familiar navigational light. It's a reasonable expectation, not an unreasonable one, that men in that role, doing that job, night after night, would recognize a lighthouse beam for exactly what it was. And critically, the ground evidence at the heart of the case, the triangular depressions pressed into the forest floor, the broken and scorched branches high in the canopy, and the radiation readings Holt's team recorded directly at the site are not explained by either a distant lighthouse or a meteor burning up miles overhead. Both of those phenomena occur in the sky. Neither one leaves a physical mark on a forest floor. Whatever accounts for the ground evidence requires something physical, low to the earth, present in the forest itself. Even the radiation readings themselves have become a battleground in the decades since. Contemporary researchers re-examining the original 1980 data have disputed exactly how significant the elevated readings really were, arguing that some fell within a range that could be explained by natural background variation in that specific soil composition, while others maintain the readings were genuinely anomalous and worth taking seriously. It is, in short, a case where nearly every individual piece of physical evidence has been argued over for more than 40 years, and where, so far, no single explanation, mundane or otherwise, accounts convincingly for all of it at once. If the physical evidence divides researchers, what happened to Jim Penniston in the years that followed divides them even further, and takes the case somewhere far stranger than a simple sighting versus skeptic debate. For over a decade after the incident, Penniston maintained a remarkably consistent and restrained public account. He had encountered a craft of unknown origin. He had documented what he observed as precisely as he could, and he could not identify its origin, its purpose, or its manufacturer. By most descriptions from researchers who interviewed him during this period, he was one of the more conservative and cautious voices connected to the case, resistant to extraterrestrial framing, insistent on sticking closely to what he could personally verify and defend. That changed in September of 1994 when Penniston agreed to undergo regression hypnosis in an attempt to recover additional memory of the encounter. Specifically targeting a string of binary code he said he had transcribed directly from the object's surface during the original encounter. A sequence of ones and zeros he claimed to have copied down but never fully understood or been able to decode on his own. Under hypnosis, Penniston described the code in markedly different terms than he had before, not simply as symbols observed and copied from an external surface, but as information he said had been placed directly into his mind during the encounter, almost like a transmission rather than an inscription. When later analyzed by independent researchers working from his hypnosis session notes, portions of the sequence were interpreted as containing geographic coordinates, along with fragments some researchers read as a warning concerning humanity's future. Most strikingly of all, Penniston came to believe, following this hypnosis, that the craft he encountered was not extraterrestrial in origin at all, but temporal. A vessel, he suggested, carrying travelers not from another world, but from Earth's own distant future. When asked, during subsequent interviews, to describe the occupants of the craft, Penniston offered 3 words that have followed the case ever since, and that continue to circulate through UFO research communities to this day. They are us. It's important, in the interest of an honest account, to state this plainly. This specific narrative, the binary transmission, the coordinates, the framing of the craft as a time vessel rather than an alien one, emerged specifically under hypnosis, a method widely regarded within memory research as unreliable and genuinely prone to producing false, confabulated, or unconsciously constructed recollections. However, sincerely and vividly, they may be experienced and believed by the subject afterward. Whatever happened to Jim Penniston in that forest in December of 1980, what he described emerging from a 1994 hypnosis session cannot reasonably be treated as independently corroborated fact. But it also cannot be cleanly separated from the case's broader legacy, because Penniston never publicly recanted the account in the years that followed, and because it remains, to this day, the single strangest and most divisive thread running through a case that was already, by any measure, unusually strange. More than 4 decades on, the Rendlesham Forest Incident occupies a genuinely unique position in the history of unexplained phenomena. It is, by nearly every measure researchers use to evaluate these cases, the best documented UFO encounter ever produced by a Western military. An official government memorandum. A real-time audio recording made by a senior officer as events unfolded rather than reconstructed afterward from memory. Multiple independent signed witness statements, taken separately by trained Air Force investigators specifically to prevent cross-contamination. Physical ground evidence. photographed and measured within hours of the encounter. And it happened not in some remote, unverifiable desert stretch, but directly adjacent to one of the most secure and closely monitored military installations in all of Cold War Europe. And yet, for all of that documentation, no definitive conclusion has ever been formally reached by any government and by no consensus among the researchers who have spent careers on this single case. The British Ministry of Defence closed its file decades ago and has shown no indication of reopening it. Successive Freedom of Information releases through the 2000s added new documents and additional detail to the public record, but no resolution to the central question. The Lighthouse and Meteor theories account for meaningful parts of the case, and account for them convincingly. But they do not account for all of it, and the parts they leave unexplained happen to be the parts closest to the ground, closest to the physical world, and hardest to wave away as misidentification. What makes Rendlesham endure more than 4 decades after the fact isn't a single dramatic photograph, or a viral clip, or one charismatic witness telling a good story on camera. It's the accumulation of ordinary, credible people, trained security personnel doing their assigned jobs, a career deputy base commander with nothing obvious to gain from fabrication, a local forester with no connection to the Air Force at all, a farmer noticing agitated livestock, each independently describing fragments of the same impossible night, and refusing, even decades later, under oath, in sworn legal documents, to take any of it back. Charles Halt is now in his 90s. He has spent considerably more of his life defending and clarifying this account than he ever spent actually investigating it on the ground in December of 1980. Jim Penniston, for his part, still maintains, in interviews given decades after the fact, well into his own retirement, that whatever he encountered and touched in that forest was genuinely real, and that the experience changed the course of his life in ways he has never fully been able to explain to skeptics or believers alike. Rendlesham Forest still stands today, largely unchanged. The landing site itself is now a modest clearing, marked only by a small memorial post placed there by researchers years after the fact. Visited every December by small groups of people trying to stand exactly where Burroughs and Penniston once stood, looking up at the same narrow gap in the canopy, waiting, usually in vain, for the story to somehow repeat itself. Whatever moved through those trees in the final days of December 1980, a misidentified coastal beacon, a piece of natural debris burning up overhead, or something no official explanation has ever fully accounted for. It left behind considerably more than a strange story passed between airmen. It left a formal memo that a government eventually had to answer for under Freedom of Information law. A tape recording that a decorated colonel had to explain and re-explain for the rest of his life. And a question that, more than 4 decades later, still has no closing file, no final report, and no consensus answer. This has been Britain's Roswell, the Rendlesham Forest Incident.